Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on virtual threats, terrorist financing via online gaming. I'm Dr. Jessica Davis, an Associate Fellow with CFS RUSI, and today we're going to speak to Gonzalo Saiz on his new report and explore this really challenging space. Before we get started, though, a bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to ask Gonzalo questions for about the first 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to turn to the audience for questions. So please use the Q&A function so they can easily track those questions. And in case anyone hasn't read this excellent report, it can be found on the Center for Finance and Security's website, and we'll be sure to drop it in the chat during this discussion. So first, Gonzalo, let me congratulate you, first of all, on a really interesting report. I read this with a great deal of interest, and it really made me reflect on my time working in the Canadian government. When I worked at FinTrack, our financial intelligence unit, I remember hearing a fair bit about this issue, broadly defined as terrorist financing through virtual assets. Um, but since that time, which was really around the late 2010s, so, a few years since then, I haven't heard much else about it. So why do you think that is? And why do you think that this is an important thing that we need to be talking about today?
Thank you very much, Jess. And thank you very much for joining us today and everyone online. I think that first question clearly reflects why I'm very keen to have this conversation with you and the wealth of experience that you bring to the discussion. It's a great starting point. I think looking into this space, we have realized, and you very adeptly formulated through the lens also of virtual assets, because I think some of these topics are often conflated. And some of those concerns in the early years, I think around 2010s when this started to resonate, it was starting to look into very obscure platforms where transparency was not really there, lacking regulations. And also, admittedly, after concluding this research, I think a lot of the concerns maybe haven't fully materialized yet. We see that terrorist groups still rely primarily on the usage of cash and traditional methods, legitimate and traditional banking, as well as informal value transfer systems, the use of charities. The paper delves quite deeply as well into the operations of right-wing extremists that we continue to see that mainly fundraise through merchandise and organization of events such as concerts and mixed martial arts fighting events. So I think the regulatory focus has shifted as this concerns over the potential financial abuses of platforms such as cryptocurrencies or the gaming space have tried to keep up as this alternative methods kind of start to proliferate, but still remain rather underdeveloped. And I think so does the research. I would add that also when we're looking at this from a counter-terrorist financing perspective, we often are overshadowed by the pair tag of anti-money laundering. So any regulation and real concern that has been explored into these platforms have also followed the AML lens and less so CTF. On the side of terrorism, we have looked into the gaming space for quite some time now, but mostly focused on propaganda and recruitment efforts, and the financial dimension yet has remained a bit underexplored. So hopefully this paper has contributed to shining a bit of light into this shadowy space.
I was really struck when I was reading the report about some of the microtransactions that you were describing. So basically, you write that microtransactions allow players to buy and sell in-game items, and then ultimately this can be, for lack of a better term, off-ramped from these virtual spaces into the real world. So can you provide some examples of what those might be for people who are not immersed in the gaming world, and sort of describe for all of us how an illicit actor could generate profits from this?
Absolutely. I think that's very useful context. Sometimes when we're looking into the gaming space, it's its own virtual world with its own operations, and basically microtransactions are transactions that happen in game. So there's different options. Users, gamers can choose to purchase different cosmetic items known as skins, so different outfits, different types of weapons for their characters, power-ups to attain new skills or expansions into the worlds that they're playing in. So there's different types of assets that can be purchased in these games. added to this, there's also in-game currencies. There's one of the most popular games for quite some time now. For instance, Fortnite has its own in-game currency, V-Bucks, which can be purchased with fiat money and then exchanged in the game for different types of assets. And this microtransactions will happen on platform. There's also some concern about loot boxes, which is this type of treasure chests that you can pay money for. They will give you randomized items, which do raise some concerns about the potential overlaps with certain more traditional looking like gambling, because in the end you're provided randomized items. But these purchases that might look like, for instance, an individual buying this in-game assets, often with prepaid cards, could be potentially stolen cards as well, and then resold in third-party platforms for fiat currency or cryptocurrency. But the methodology of these operations fits more traditionally the scope of money laundering typologies. So we haven't really seen terrorist financing or extremist financing happening through these types of activities. So the paper then explores more deeply activities related to the development of games that might contain extremist narratives or symbology and other types of fundraising that maybe step a bit beyond what we might think was the most exposed vulnerability, which is in-game assets, but it fits more the AML concerns in that regard.
So just so we're crystal clear on this, because I think that, for some people like myself who aren't big in the gaming world, not because I think there's anything wrong with that, but because I don't think I could step away from it at any point in time if I started. The way that it works would be something as follows, and correct me if I'm wrong. So you would use a credit card or a prepaid card to buy goods, services, whatever in the gaming environment. You could then sell those or give them away to other players who could, or you could, and once you sell them, how do you get your money back out of the platform?
So that's a good question. The way that this can be used is by going through a third-party platform where you're promoting the sale of this in-game currencies, and then you will be paid in fiat because you're providing those goods at a discounted price. So it's a classic money laundering scheme where you might have a good, undersell it to then get that virtual currency and then extract it through a more traditional financial transaction fiat currency. But I would say what we're seeing is also this might happen, and the more challenging risk is that it happens through cryptocurrencies. So you can divert those operations to the blockchain. Transactions can be monitored in that regard, but then unveiling the real user behind them will be the challenge. And often these communications happen through the gaming platforms or gaming adjacent platforms. So this could be Discord or Twitch. These are communication platforms that are very popular among gamers, and they have chat functionalities, live streaming, and they facilitate these conversations. And they can also turn to instant messaging, which even has peer-to-peer encryption. So then unveiling the network behind it and how the communication has happened is increasingly challenging.
So then I guess there's like third-party marketplaces in addition to all of the inherent gaming platform capabilities that can enable all of this activity.
Exactly.
You said something else that I want to flag on right away because your paper talks about both terrorist and extremist financing. So you raise this issue of extremist financing and point to the definitional issue. So obviously, counter-terrorist financing regulations refer specifically to terrorists, but some of the risks in the space are inhabited by extremists. So people who maybe haven't crossed that threshold into violent action or who aren't defined in national laws as terrorist actors. So how, in your view, do we reconcile these issues, particularly when, that counter-terrorist financing, from a legal perspective, only applies to terrorists? So what are your thoughts on that?
Excellent question. And this is something that we try to highlight quite prominently at RUSI and through Project Craft. We have seen the language in publications from the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, Europol in its assessments of the terrorist threat in Europe, and they increasingly use the term violent extremism, which we welcome, as somebody who tries to expand the label of counterterrorism financing, not just to monitor individuals or groups that have been designated and placed on a sanctions list, but to monitor the wider threat landscape. But this process poses very great challenges to both authorities and the private sector. They have a responsibility to, as you say, just focus on the terrorist side. And then we have this gray area of violent extremism that has not yet been proscribed, extremists that might feed the ideological milieus and discourse, but have not engaged in violent activities. So the monitoring of their activities will present very basic challenges to obliged entities. So compliance department in a financial institution that sees these transactions that might seem suspicious, but their connection to terrorism is not quite there. So should they be submitting a suspicious transaction report to their financial intelligence unit in order to kickstart an investigation? And if they must, well, surely this is a bit outside the scope of their regulatory obligations. So maybe we should reconsider where the label really remains and what we have to really look out for. Because whilst a lot of firms might want to stay clear of any risks and submit as much information as possible, this is not really mandatory for others. So those that are yet maybe lack the awareness of the typologies that are of the actors that are involved will, and in the end, undercut the potential to then really, which is the mission of CTF efforts, to prevent and disrupt the financing of potential attacks before they happen. So I'm curious, Jessica, if I can throw the question back to you. If you, during your time at FinTrack, as you were telling us, if this is something that you have been facing, and how do authorities try to create this combination of it sticking to the CTF mission, but while monitoring actors that might not as comfortably fit the label?
Yeah, you weren't going to get away without me sharing my views on this because I think it's such an interesting conversation. To be honest, it wasn't something that came up so much during my time at FinTrack. It was much later in my career that I started to sort of see this issue arising. And there's a couple of things. I think, first of all, the tools, the I think about CTF as like this toolbox or this bucket of activities that we engage in. I think I've identified 8 or 9 different categories. Um, but in order for us to apply some of those tools, things like sanctions, you actually have to have a group listed or designated as a terrorist entity under national laws. So, we can't get away from that in some instances. But in other cases, um, you don't necessarily have to have that legal definition. So these tools can be extended to things like violent extremism or extremism writ large. The thing that raises concerns for me, though, is when reporting entities, financial intelligence units with banks and other financial entities start taking on the role of mediating what is or is not terrorist financing in a country. Like I don't necessarily think that that's where we want to be. Um, so I think there's a bit of an ebb and flow here, some pros and cons in terms of how we um, deal with this issue. But it's also very interesting, right? Because increasingly we're seeing divergence between countries about what is considered to be a terrorist actor. Canada has designated groups like the Proud Boys, not designated in most other countries around the world as terrorist entities. So there's a lot of variation now in terms of what can and should be reported. And I think your paper does a great job of highlighting some of those tensions. And to a certain extent, these are really important definitional issues, but we've gotten ourselves into a bit of a quagmire here that I think we as a CTF community need to do a bit more work to figure out how that should happen. I also think, in some countries where privacy laws are really strong, banks are not going to allow extremist financing to be reported because it doesn't actually meet the suspicious transaction or suspicious activity threshold of terrorism. So there's a lot of different things that we can unpack here. But let's get back to the gaming issue for now, because I think you and I could probably talk about this for quite some time. Um, so yes, I wanted to talk about the risks of illicit financing through gaming platforms. This was really raised in several 2019 articles, which is, 6 years ago, specifically looking at Counter-Strike and Fortnite. So why do you think this hasn't received more regulatory attention?
Great question. And actually, the Counter-Strike example I cited in the paper as well, because there's one of the more concerning statistics that I've heard in this space is that Valve, the gaming developer and the platform where many of these games that we're discussing can be purchased. There's specific game, Counter-Strike, one of, again, massively popular with millions of users across the world. Valve admitted that nearly all microtransactions happening through the game were related to money laundering and some type of criminal activity. So they shut down the operations and they halted all microtransactions. But we really allowed this to proliferate. And I think the paper tries to really highlight how, whilst the volumes of illicit finance might be difficult to be actually determined, given it's a traditionally anonymous users, that there's no KYC in a lot of these gaming platforms, so we don't really know either the actors involved, the transactions that might be happening off platform. It's difficult to trace, but still the vulnerabilities that lie in this ecosystem are quite grave. Though there has been some sort of regulation trying to come through slowly. The fifth anti-money laundering directive in the EU did expand to then regulate providers that allowed the exchange of fiat for virtual currencies, but it left out currencies that might be just exclusively used in gaming platforms. So it was left out of regulation. I think this is due to maybe a misunderstanding of how these currencies could be abused. It's a fake currency that has no real value in our real world, but there's a lot of users that have an interest in purchasing these assets. So they will pay real money and, of course, both fiat and cryptocurrencies to purchase them. So I think now the regulation is starting to realize that it stopped too short, and it might have to catch up to the vulnerabilities that we're now seeing. As you said, this already happened back in 2019, so it's been 6 years that we could explore this. I'm not sure if the new AML package that the EU has adopted has really mitigated this effort. When I was looking into it, it again had been omitted. And going back to a point I made earlier, we keep talking about the anti-money laundering directive, the AML package. When we look at the full title, is anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. But a lot of the thresholds that are being put in place just fit the AML side of the discussion and not so much the CTF. So I think the difficulty in regulating this space is also related to the opacity of the ecosystem, and a lot of the platforms are both gaming and gaming adjacent. I was mentioning this more communications-oriented platforms related to the gaming ecosystem. They are not obliged entities. They do not report suspicious financial transactions that they might be seeing to a regulator. So any concerns that they might have related to terrorism or extremism is more related to propaganda, recruitment, and others. But again, they stop short of exploring the financial side. So I think the paper tries to overcome that and identify where these risks could be further identified. The main challenge is data collection, of course. So maybe we could explore how the EU or the FATF would explore this further, but we can leave that until to discuss further later.
Yeah, I smiled when you were talking about how the EU views those virtual assets, because it was very similar to language we used to use around cryptocurrency in terms of, not real, there's no real value, all of these kinds of things, but people still
Exactly.
pay money for them. Anyways, just a little side there. I do want to talk about a particular example that you have in your paper. So you write about how extremists are raising money through games, and you cite the example of Alex Jones, among others. So my question is for you, like, what are they doing with this money?
Well, that's an excellent question. In the case of Alex Jones, it's for those of you that might not be familiar with him, it's a very contentious character over in the US. He is now facing a $1 billion fine for denying the school shooting in the Sandy Hook school. So potentially he might be using a lot of this money. I think the estimates are ranging in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so it can continue to support its platforms, to continue its narratives, pay for the very substantial legal defense and fines that they face. But looking beyond actors like Alex Jones, and I mentioned some others in the paper, like Nick Fuentes. Also, they have collaborated together. Another white supremacist, let's say, speaker or activist in North America. And a lot of their activities, whilst they might be fundraising substantial amounts of money, and again, we're facing this challenge of maybe we should place them on the extremist side of the discussion. We can't really attribute that the expenditure of these funds will go to a violent cause, for instance. So again, running into this wall of would this be flagged as terrorist financing, and would this be ultimately reported? So unfortunately, I'd say it wouldn't. I think it's still something worthy of monitoring, as a lot of those actors in the end belong to wider networks, and they have some sort of affiliation to groups such as the Proud Boys that you mentioned earlier, that they might not be designating one country, but they are in Canada. So this transactions and international flows ultimately something worth keeping an eye out, even if the violent side of the operations might not be as clear.
Yeah, when I was reading your paper, it really struck me that this is very similar to other kinds of extremist financing that we see, where it's not necessarily directly linked to violence, but it is linked to propaganda creation, dissemination, broader support networks. And in some cases, I think, a lot of people who are in the extremist environment have a hard time keeping jobs because, they say awful things online and employers don't want to be associated with that. So a lot of extremist financing actually just goes to supporting people and replacing their livelihood because they've said and done such awful things that nobody wants to employ them. And I think obviously that's not terrorist financing, but it is a really interesting implication on the extremist financing side of things, right? Because you have people who are now able to support themselves and perpetuate these extremist narratives.
Indeed, and they ultimately become certain brands of in and of themselves. So
Yeah,
it,
influencers.
it does become, even if they lose their traditional workplace, they then make a livelihood out of their more extremist narrative and the agendas that they might have through public speaking and live streaming different sorts of events. So certainly it falls more on the unsavory category than real violent extremism, but I'll be wary of omitting it altogether, and thus I chose to include it in the research.
Yeah, I think that's right because as a lot of terrorism scholars would call it, it's lawful but awful. But I think it is an important aspect of the financing, and it also doesn't take very much for that to cross that line into terrorist financing, right? So right now we see a lot of it in sort of extremist support and propaganda creation, which is not necessarily terrorist financing, but then if and or when there's violence associated with it, all of a sudden that is flipped. So we do want to have more situational awareness on this rather than less. Um,
Indeed, and ultimately they're also very prominent figures that might serve as inspiration to other actors. So this typology of abuse then might be a model to follow for others that might then engage in violence and terrorist acts.
exactly. Um, Going back to your paper for a little bit, though, whenever I see estimates of money, sort of the alarm bells in the back of my mind go off because I want to know more about it. So you cite a few cases where extremists have raised pretty significant sums through these platforms. And so like I want to get your take, like are these estimates reliable? And what issues have come up for you in terms of trying to figure out how much money is actually changing hands on these platforms? So like it's really a question of how are we estimating this? How are we determining scope and scale?
That's a great question. A lot of the figures reflected in the paper come from the great work done by other RUSI colleagues and those supporting the EGRN network related to extremist gaming and radicalization. So they have tried to monitor sales on Steam, so different types of uh, uh, platforms that distribute video games. Some of these sales are public. Some of the estimates also rely on self-disclosures of the actors behind them, which of course it's one source point, but not necessarily a reliable one. But certainly these are estimates that I believe might be approximate, but remain rough. I would not get stuck on the specific amounts, but more the volumes that might be lying behind them. Of course, we also have to take into account that if we are talking about a game that might have raised a few thousand dollars, whilst substantial, and we could argue that $1 is $1 too many that they've made already for their as revenue. We have to compare about also the costs that they incurred in developing a lot of these games and initiatives. So it might not, I think what I wanted to also caution is not to overstate really the volumes that might be involved. I'm more interested in the potential abuse that might stem from the vulnerabilities in the system and the lack of oversight and regulation that than potential flows that have emerged in the past. But I think it's more an indication of where the risks might lie.
Um, I also wanted to talk about some of the, some of the concrete things behind this. So have we seen any legal cases involving money laundering and terrorist financing through these types of assets, commodities, or currencies? Because I think, for me, seeing these kinds of things go through the courts is really a great way to highlight the methods that are being used and how aware maybe law enforcement is about them. So what have you seen?
Mhm. So I am through interviews with law enforcement, I'm aware of ongoing investigations into these abuses. I'm not aware as of now of specific prosecutions or convictions that have been attained on either money laundering and terrorist financing in the gaming space. Certainly the case of Counter-Strike, as I mentioned earlier, and the 90+% of the transactions being having a criminal link. I'm not sure if that was ultimately they faced any sort of fine or monetary penalty, but I think it's also part of the challenge of not only identifying the risk, but then if abuse is committed, uh, collecting the necessary evidence to then convict someone for these activities. So I mentioned earlier, and it's a point that I try to raise in the paper. The A lot of the information that is communicated among these actors is shared via voice or video. That there are some initiatives to counter that. Some games as prominent as Call of Duty have introduced voice moderation through AI to pick up on specific keywords. I'm not sure if there's any input on financial terms being shared. That would be interesting to explore. Of course, the potential for false positive merging would be great. But there are some initiatives to try to mitigate. But then what law enforcement agencies raise is that when they have to go back to an investigation to trace what potential transactions might have happened and what information has been shared on different communication platforms, this is not easily retrievable as it was not written in that traditional chat function. And the conversations are often moved to instant messaging that are encrypted. So if we haven't seen substantial court cases happening, might also be related to the challenge of actually collecting the right evidence for an effective prosecution.
Yeah, when I was reading the paper, this is one of the things that really struck me. I was like, we might not have a lot of evidence of this happening. And so maybe a lot of it isn't like maybe it's not a huge issue, but it's also possible that maybe we're not very good at detecting it, right? Like depending on the capabilities of the investigator and what kind of technical access they have to platforms, what kind of authorizations they have, whether or not they're able to actually observe the chats and capture the voice and understand what's actually happening in the gaming environment, there's a lot of ifs there, right? And if they're even looking for this kind of thing. So I thought that was quite interesting. So what do you think? Like, do you think that we're missing this in our investigations? Like, is it too difficult to detect?
I fear it is. On the one hand, I don't want to overstate the scale to which this abuse might be happening at this point in time. But on the other, we know that terrorist financiers more broadly, criminals are increasingly savvy to avoid detection, and they're picking up the different disruption mechanisms that are and controls that are being put in place. What was raised also by some law enforcement agency looking dedicated to counter-terrorist financing is that if they know that a specific discourse will pick up potentially some monitoring from the gaming platform or a communications platform or social media, if they have any content moderation rules related to extremist content, then they will simply communicate bilaterally through more secure and encrypted communication channels and say, we'll be live streaming something that is apparently legitimate. There's no connection to extremist narratives. So it could just be live streaming a football match. And then donations made to that live stream, then it will be very difficult to detect that proactively. If you then unveil the user behind that channel and you then trace back potential donations, that could be a way of doing it if it has not been facilitated via crypto and primarily the use of privacy coins such as Monero. But I fear that my concerns on the gaming space relate specifically to how challenging it would be to actually disrupt illicit flows that might be happening through these platforms, as well as, for instance, use of social media and particularly those that are dedicated to free speech and have scarce regulation and moderation, such as 4chan and others. They don't have any incentive to really combat this. And if they were to pick up on anything, they're not lied on established communication channels with regulators or law enforcement. So I think to combat any potential abuse, we're quite far behind in terms of capabilities.
On a related note, has there been any outreach to gaming companies and platforms to discuss these issues? And if so, what has their response been?
So I think, given that the focus has traditionally lied on curtailing recruitment efforts and propaganda, there has been ample outreach to the gaming domain on that front. So that if you look at the statistics shared by prominent platforms such as Discord, they have statistics where they deplatform thousands of individuals for engaging in extremist behavior or sharing controversial views that were breaching the terms and conditions of the platform. So they have been responsive to this side. I think since our regulatory focus has not yet reached the scale of the financial domain, I think outreach has not met that either. So I think a lot of these platforms, in their good intentions and acknowledging their very substantial steps that they've taken in content moderation, they should be targeted with further outreach to raise awareness on the potential vulnerabilities related to terrorist financing and extremist financing. But then again, why would they look into extremist financing when others don't? So it's again the challenge that we're facing across the board, and a discussion that I would encourage the Financial Action Task Force as kind of the watchdog of counter-terrorist financing to really revisit and to explain the implications of their statements into the risks of the financing of violent extremism and how that pairs back to a regional conversation with the traditional CTF obligations that reporting entities actually have.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because we have already a lot of difficulty having terrorist content removed from major platforms like X, formerly Twitter. And I would argue even more difficulty having extremist content removed from other platforms, particularly those that have been created specifically to develop like a home for free speech. So what do you think the prospects are of galvanizing the international community to address the risks in the gaming platforms today?
Excellent question. I think in certain gaming platforms that are traditional and the revenue levels they face just through legitimate business are so substantial, I think they would be interested in keeping a clean slate of operations and not falling for facilitating these types of activities. So I think they would react positively to monitoring this space. I think the challenge would lie, as we mentioned, in detection. And I think social media is a key enabler of terrorist financing. It facilitates the dissemination of financial information, the propaganda. It serves as a platform to then divert others to more encrypted and anonymized channels. And it has continuously avoided any sort of regulation related to counter-terrorist financing. And I've seen sectors being abused and then increasingly brought under the AML CFT scope. I think social media should be targeted with this. How positive the outcome will be and how realistic this is, I'm afraid I might not see any positive outcomes coming out soon, anytime soon. I think the scale would be great. We're seeing major platforms such as X getting rid of content moderation and staff working on this and the AI tools that might identify uh, the sharing of this information. So I think there's not a positive trend to actually combat this happening on social media. But again, I think this lies on being creative at a legislative and regulatory scale and really mitigate the risks that we're seeing to bring social media into some sort of regulatory framework, acknowledging the very different activity that it's not a financial institution, so it doesn't have the KYC tools that it does a bank would do. But I think there's scope for us to do better and really curtail a main vector for terrorist financing.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking about the profits of some of these gaming companies and possible incentives for getting them to, take action and moderate their platforms a bit more. I'm I'm skeptical personally as well in terms of, we talk in the CFT world about the reputational risk of banks and other financial institutions being used for terrorist financing, but I've actually not seen that as being a huge motivator to get financial entities to enhance their compliance. Um, the only thing that I think that has worked really in this space has been fines, and the bigger the better. I would also argue, though, that those have been an imperfect solution. So I'm not necessarily arguing for a particular policy approach here. I'm just saying that this is a difficult space, and overcoming that profit motive is really difficult, especially because every step that platforms take, whether it's a social media or a gaming platform, to moderate content and enforce particular norms and regulations comes at a cost, and that comes at a cost to the bottom line. And maybe I'm feeling a little anti-capitalist today, but I don't necessarily think that these actors are motivated by the greater good. I have
Oh,
one last
I
question.
I,
Yeah.
I want to echo your last statement, and I think it's motivated by maybe reputational risks and also regulatory responses. So I share your concerns and maybe a lack of optimism in this regard.
So just for the audience, I'm going to ask Gonzalo one more question. So if you have questions, get them in the Q&A and I'll go through those in a moment. But for Gonzalo, so who specifically do you think should be leading on this? Should it be the Financial Action Task Force? Should it be Tech Against Terrorism, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, a coalition of states? Who do you think owns this problem?
So, excellent question. I think it's a shared problem. The Financial Action Task Force has CTF in its mandate, and almost every country in the world has recognized its mandate and are committed to performing according to the standards that it sets out. I think there are very interesting reports coming out from the FATF as risks evolve and are identified. So I encourage the FATF to explore this deeper and conduct a sectoral risk assessment. Maybe its risks, trends, and methods working group could explore this topic. We saw recent reports on online crowdfunding and its connections to terrorist financing. So the FATF is active in monitoring the evolving threat landscape and identifying potential solutions. So I think we need countries to provide the intelligence in order to have a better, more accurate data set into the vulnerabilities and actual scale of abuse that we're seeing. The paper just tries to bring a big arrow into this problem and point to it, but we don't have the scale of resources that it would have to call for intelligence sharing by the number of law enforcement agencies operating internationally. I would include the EU and its AML CFT risk assessments. I mentioned that the uh, AML directive left gaming out of its scope. Maybe there should be a dedicated sectoral risk assessment looking into how the EU might be abused for this purpose. And then there's a number of very valuable platforms. You mentioned Tech Against Terrorism and the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. So I think we would all benefit from more research coming into this space, typologies being shared, and standards being set by dedicated actors, as well as I would encourage industry to not only follow regulatory steps, but also engage in some sort of self-regulation to stay ahead of the curve and mitigate any potential risks that they're seeing in their activities. And finally, and I want to leave space for questions, I want to highlight that this paper and Project Craft as a whole now is funded by NATO and its Science for Peace and Security program. So I think NATO has also a mandate related to counterterrorism, and in an increasingly fragmented geopolitical community that we're seeing now, if the UN Security Council, we might see its monitoring teams not being as effective as they used to be, and resolutions maybe falling short of what they could achieve. We might need an alliance of like-minded states coming in and providing the funding into research, monitoring these activities, and encouraging their member states to look out for these sorts of threats as they emerge.
Yeah, that's all really great, Gonzalo. There's a few different things I want to pick up on there. I think one of the things that you were saying when we need more typologies and research into this, I think the other thing that I would argue for is more very clear information about how investigators could detect this kind of activity happening. One of the arguments that I make, or when I do technical assistance around the world, is that every country in the world doesn't necessarily need to be an expert in cryptocurrency, but they need to know what it looks like when it hits their investigation. I think the same argument could be made here, that you don't necessarily need to be able to understand all of the inner workings of terrorist financing via and gaming platforms, but you need to know enough that when it comes across your desk, you pick up the phone and call someone who does know. Because I, I'm a little worried that we're missing a fair bit of stuff here. Um, and then just on the international partnership piece, I think, we have a really good framework through the Financial Action Task Force and a number of different organizations that have been set up over the course of the last 20, 25 years to counter the financing of terrorism. But I agree with you. I think that given what we're seeing geopolitically, it is maybe time to think a little bit outside the box and think about what kind of allies we can be working with to start to address these issues. Um, so that's the last that I want to say about this. We've got a number of questions here. I want to start with I'll work through these questions, but I also want to apologize. So I am not great with the online gaming space. So if I mess up any of these questions, I'm very sorry. Gonzalo, I'm going to do my absolute best to give you questions that you can answer. So we'll work through this together. Um, so the first one I think is a pretty straightforward technical one. So we were at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about the dual direction flow of funds. So you can buy things on Fortnite, but you can't give items, cannot give currency, can't change Fortnite currency back to fiat, mitigates much of the risk. But games like Second Life do have actual economies. So are there any other big games that we should be aware of that really allow this dual direction flow of funds? Because this seems to be like where a pretty significant risk lies.
That's an excellent question. I didn't really explore Second Life in this paper, but I think the challenge of terrorist financing is that it's not a matter of these actors choosing for one platform or another, or one methodology or another. They will use what is at hand and what is helpful for them. I mentioned at the beginning that the lack of regulation in this space might be related to the fact that tourists simply don't need to use the gaming space as prominently now because our CTF controls and traditional financial institutions continue to face challenges in its detection and disruption. So I think it's just, as you were mentioning just in your previous statement, it's a matter of raising awareness and looking out for how these behaviors and patterns might occur across a number of platforms. If Second Life saw that its operations were increasingly exploited by certain actors, terrorists, or just criminals and fraudsters, I'm sure they would step in to try to shut it down before they face any enforcement action. We saw this with Counter-Strike. So there is specific games that might facilitate this at a higher degree. Counter-Strike saw its abuse at a higher scale than others. But I wouldn't want to highlight either one as the main vector for terrorists. And as these operations will simply shift from one to another as disruption and detection becomes enhanced in certain platforms.
Thanks, Gonzalo. That's great. It relates to a question that our friend and colleague Stephen Reimer has about the paper itself. So he asks, from your time spent working on this, what do you think are the unique benefits to terrorist financiers in raising or moving money via online games? What are their pain points they're experiencing elsewhere that might lead them to this? So like I think about this question as like a what's the adaptation that's happening? And why would it be forcing them into the online gaming platform, which I think is maybe a little more cumbersome than other methods of terrorist financing, but why don't you reflect on that for us?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much, Stephen, for tuning in. It's great to see a great collaborator of our program and former colleague. And we've actually shared research into many of these related topics. I think the reason that this paper I think has value and the reason that we decided to put it out is that as I was mentioning, monitoring and controls improve in certain domains, we're forcing actors and specifically terrorist financiers to jump into the next one. If transaction monitoring in banks has tightened its controls, we will see higher use of alternative payment systems and maybe informal value transfer systems such as Hawala being used to avoid that detection. If before terrorists could just share a QR code on social media and call for donations, as still happens to this day, if content moderation in social media improves, then we have to go into the more opaque landscape. And gaming to this day provides that capabilities. To join a gaming platform, you can have total anonymity. There's no KYC, know your customer controls in order to open an account. You can share personal information to then engage in private conversations in other platforms. Some of these chats could potentially be encrypted and then not subject to content moderation. So I think gaming has provided such capabilities to users that they're out of the traditional controls that we have, that it would serve as a very good avenue for terrorist financiers to exploit. I don't think they're doing so now, again, out of the lack of need to do so. But if we continue to let this domain roam free, they might see these operations increase, as we saw in the case of Counter-Strike. Again, I don't want to call for blanket regulation. I think an accurate risk assessment should be conducted to estimate what risk-based approach should follow to this determination.
That's really useful. Thank you, Gonzalo. So here's a bit of a longer question. It has some interesting context to it, so I'm gonna give this my best go. So a lot of gaming companies gather data through in-game currency, rewarding questionnaires, gathering sensitive information like age and gender. But this also looks like marketing data. So like, what's your favorite part of the game? Do you think this could be considered a strategy to ensure companies keep on pushing out games that are appealing for users to keep buying in-game currency? Is there any associated risks to these big companies gathering such big data assets, but the premises of an in-game reward?
Interesting. So trying to entice users to share information with a reward in order to attain those. I was not aware of those activities. So I think again, I think it might have been implied in the question. There might be a marketing side to this information collection. I think there is a risk, and I don't want to call for unnecessary data collection. We have data privacy laws in place, and we have to be very sure that whatever is being collected is within the scope of regulations and information shared does fit the obligations that are put in place. I think there are positive steps to be taken, and I'm happy to see that there are some indicators being collected by companies. But I fear this is more to identify the demographics in their platforms rather than to identify specific subjects. So while it might be positive for data collection purposes, I think it would be too general to actually have any meaningful disruption into potential terrorist financing happening through these platforms. So again, maybe a positive step, but I'm not sure if one that would be too meaningful in achieving an effective response.
There's another question here that relates, in my view, to a sort of a broader discussion. So, do you think, has there been is there a profile that's been identified for the most commonly seen terrorist financing gaming offenders? So, like gender, age, location, motive, including violent extremism. And do you think that even if there was a profile developed on this, do you think that that would be a useful tool for detecting this kind of activity?
Well, a lot of controls on construction financing, as you know, rely on this specific profile indicators, and it does include age, gender, location, and a lot of them are, of course, confidential to avoid giving out too much information. But I think with the very diverse range of actors that we're seeing across terrorism or extremist activities, there's great divergence in the types of actors involved. So whilst useful and certainly a valuable intelligence collection mechanism for both financial institutions and authorities, I think if we're looking into the operations of jihadi related groups or right-wing extremists, we're looking to quite different actors involved. We might be looking into young men in a certain age range, but locations will vary greatly. A lot of these operations happen cross-border through VPN, so disruption, like avoiding that detection would be possible. So there are indicators that are useful, but I think we're looking into a very diverse landscape as well. So Jess, with your law enforcement background, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that as well.
I have many thoughts on that, Gonzalo, but I won't take up too much time. But yeah, I think it's very easy to develop sort of common profiles of what terrorists and extremists look like. But what that does in terms of investigations is it sort of obscures all of the nuance and the details that actually lead to good investigation. So when I worked at our security intelligence service, it was very common for our senior executives to want to understand, like, what does the average terrorist look like? But when you start compiling those kinds of profiles, you miss all of the things around the edges. So like maybe yeah, you're focusing on your very narrow average, but then everybody on the outside kind of gets a pass. And I'm not saying that we use this investigatively, but even within that context, I really push back on that because I didn't think it was helpful. I thought it was much more helpful to talk about the variation and the variety of different motivations and ages and genders and all this kind of stuff that was going on. So I think that's probably where I would push the conversation. We're running a little low on time, so I want to focus on two more questions. My apologies to everyone. There's lots of questions in the Q&A that we haven't gotten a chance to. I do want to revisit something that we were talking about earlier, Gonzalo. So there's a question here about the rise of platforms like Twitch being used by bad actors to raise funds. And this question argues that Twitch is an Amazon brand and this kind of activity could have a significant impact on their reputation. So why do you feel like these platforms are not motivated to try and do more to combat this activity? So let's revisit this motivation question.
Yes, so great question, and I touched upon briefly the reputational risks earlier, and I think both there's the Jess, you rightly pointed out that a lot of the steps that are taken by private firms are not motivated by just goodwill. There's an incentive, economic. They're profit-driven businesses that will seek to have less regulation and operate freely. But nobody wants to be known as the platform that facilitated the communication between actors that then committed a terrorist attack. So I think there is an incentive, and I would highlight again their efforts on content moderation. I think it's related to a lack of awareness of the terrorist financing. I think continuously is neglected at a more mainstream discourse level. And I would encourage governments to continue their outreach specifically on CTF to a lot of these companies, and then give the specific indicators and typologies on the types of, as Jess was mentioning, there's indicators of the actors, but they might be too vague. So more about the narratives that might be being shared, and then look into the financial dimension of those operators. I think Twitch would react very positively to a nudge, both from the public sector or its parent company, to crack down on these sorts of operations, including extremist financing. And I'm sure it would entail a breach of their terms and conditions and other arguments that they could use to deplatform these actors.
Great. And I want to go to one more question, Gonzalo. And I actually think that this one might be the subject of your next paper on this topic, but let me know what you think. So we already talked about how difficult it might be to detect some of these financial transactions. Can you maybe try to turn your attention to how investigators should start looking for this and what evidence to look for that this is happening in their investigations?
Uh,
And if you don't have an answer to that, maybe you can outline a research project for this.
yes, indeed. I think it's, as you say, worthy of research output in itself. And maybe you can complement as the last question with a bit of your background. It's challenging to say what investigators should be doing, as it will vary depending on the type of exposure that they might be seeing in their specific jurisdiction and the actors that they might be looking into. There's, I believe, extensive investigations being conducted with investigators joining these platforms, joining online communities to identify what types of behaviors they're engaging in. So if you see a specific group of individuals that belong to an extremist milieu and they are convening online over specific games, you can join, see how they're operating, what type of information they're sharing. But it's hard to pin down what this might look like, as then it would very much rely on getting the confidence of the actors behind it, and then transition to the more secure communication platforms. So I'm afraid it's hard to say where this might start. And I already highlighted how a lot of this activities are becoming more and more discreet as they see detection efforts coming their way. So Jess, maybe you can give us a bit more to close the webinar on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that question. I think to answer the question, I would start with more research. And one of the main research questions that I would ask is I would try to conduct interviews with people who are doing or have done investigations in this space and try to figure out what the lead or initiating information was that actually pinged them to the idea that this was happening on a gaming platform, and sort of start there and sort of see what that lead information looked like and see if that could be extrapolated into sort of investigative indicators that could then be pushed out to other law enforcement and investigative agencies as a starting point. Because I think you already mentioned it too, like there's not a lot of cases on this. So one of the places that I always go to when I'm looking for investigative guidance or indicators is I look at concluded cases to sort of see how things happen, and I build out from there. But without that information, we would have to go back to the source and try to extract that information from investigators. But that's where I would start to answer this question.
Mhm.
Anything you
Thank
want
you.
to add on that, Gonzalo?
I think that was a perfect note to end. Thank you very much, Jess.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the entire audience for your active participation. It's been really great to see so many familiar names in the chat and Q&A. Gonzalo, thank you very much for such a wonderful paper and a really great conversation. I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you very much, Jess. It was great to have you on board today. And thank you everyone for your questions and joining us for the discussion. I do encourage you to reach out. Please follow Project Craft and our CFS team online. And it'd be great to keep in touch, and any unresolved questions, maybe we can explore further in future events. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you.